The late afternoon sky was bruised gray, like an old welt on the worn-out skin of a dying town. The last light had pulled back from the rusted edges of the feed store's tin roof, leaving behind nothing but the color of ash and a creeping darkness that slipped through the warped wooden slats. Dry wind swept through the alley behind the storage shed, carrying the stale scent of old sweat kerosene, and something heavier, something like silence, thick enough to choke on. There in the dim haze of dusk and the quiet columns of dust, a transaction took place without a cry, without a receipt, without witnesses, except for bruises and a pair of silent, unblinking eyes. Clara sat on the cold-packed earth wrists bound by rusted iron cuffs, skin raw and red, like wilted flowers made of blood. Her loose dress did nothing to hide her swollen belly 8 months along and rising with every shallow breath. She refused to look at anyone. Her eyes fixed instead on a crack in the wall, as if staring long enough might open it wide and swallow her whole into a place where her mother didn't exist, where the child in her womb didn't trap her, where the man standing across the room in the shadows didn't look like he might have stepped straight out of a grave. The man's name was Elias. No one really knew much about him, just town whispers and loose tongues, that his wife had died, that he never had kids, that he lived alone on the edge of the valley, didn't drink, didn't pray, didn't smile. When he stepped into the back shed of the feed store, no one greeted him. No one asked why he was there. He just nodded, once his eyes never settling on Clara, but drifting behind her like he saw something haunting the wood-paneled walls. $15. Clara's mother said, her voice dry and sharp like the crack of an axe. And half a steer come fall. Some whiskey wouldn't hurt either. Elias didn't haggle. He laid down 2 silver coins, dull, and faded a heavy jug of liquor and a note promising meat when the season turned. No handshakes, no gratitude. Just the metallic clink of cuffs unlatching like the untying of a feed sack. "Don't cause him trouble," her mother muttered, shoving Clara forward like property being transferred. "He paid more than you're worth." Clara didn't protest. Not a word. She rose slowly, crossing that invisible line between being someone's burden and someone else's burden. Her eyes didn't weep. They were too dry, too full of dust and flame, like a field that had been harvested down to nothing. Elias didn't touch her. He only stepped outside, gave the saddle a quiet pat, and waited by the sweat-dampened horse. Clara climbed up with the last of her strength, her hand clutching the reins like it was the only thing keeping her from shattering. The evening wind lashed at them like some cruel blessing from a land that had long since stopped having a heart. They rode 3 miles down dirt-choked trails beneath pine trees that didn't sing, that didn't whisper, just stood like sentries to something long forgotten. Hoofbeats drummed steady in the silence, the only sound besides the heavy breath of 2 people who'd both run out of things to believe in. Clara sat behind the saddle hand, cradling her belly, a final act of instinct, not hope. The child stirred lightly inside her, like it too could feel the shift coming, though it couldn't yet tell whether it was freedom or another kind of prison. Elias's house waited at the end of a nowhere road. No fence, no lantern, no chimney smoke. It looked more like a tomb with a roof than a home slumped and gray forgotten. The porch steps were bowed with time walls, weathered to the color of dried bone, and the air around it held the stillness of a fire long since burned out. He helped her down from the horse with a simple motion. No guiding hand, no careful words, just a nod toward the door. Clara stepped into the house like a ghost seeking shelter. The scent of pine wood, lemon oil, and old smoke clung to the air, clean but too clean. The room he pointed her to held a wooden bed, a basin of water, and a quilt far too fine for the rest of the house. A crooked photograph hung on the wall, a woman holding a baby blanket, but no baby in sight. Clara said nothing. Her fingers brushed the inner edge of her boot, where a thin blade was sewn into the lining, one of the few things her mother hadn't stripped from her. She didn't plan to use it, not yet, but it was there reminding her that if she had to run, at least she still had one choice left, the manner of her own ending. That night she didn't sleep, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the hilt beneath her pillow. Outside, the bugs chirped like souls crying into the void. No footsteps came. No doors opened. Just wind slipping through cracks in the wood like something whispering secrets in a tongue only ghosts understood. A story had begun, and Clara hadn't been asked if she wanted to be part of it. A story that opened with the price of a person. A story as bleak as the land it was born from. The room Elias gave Clara was as cold as the look they first exchanged. Rough wooden walls, a small window that filtered light into pale yellow streaks across the floor. A basin of water sat near the stove, steam rising faintly, but there was no greeting, no word of welcome. The room held a wooden bed, a hand-stitched quilt, perhaps the only trace that someone had once cared for this place long ago, before they left it behind. Clara tucked her knife carefully beneath the pillow. She lay on her sidearms wrapped around her belly, as if to remind herself there was still a life inside her. Still one reason not to fall apart in this house, soaked in a silence too thick to trust. Elias didn't step inside the room. He didn't pry. The first night passed like that. No threats, no rough hands, but no comfort either. Only the wind brushing the roof, the horse sneezing somewhere out in the dark, and the steady, uncertain thump of her heart. The next morning, when Clara opened her door, she found a piece of bread and a jar of strawberry jam neatly set on the kitchen table. No note. No sign of anyone. She looked around and saw Elias's boots were gone, his coat missing from the hook. He'd left where to, she didn't know. But she ate in silence, unforced. The bread was still warm. The jam was sweeter than she expected. For the first time in days, her throat didn't feel like sandpaper. The days that followed passed the same way, repeating, but never empty. Each morning brought bread jam, sometimes a boiled egg, or a slice of smoked meat left to cool. Each night she heard Elias outside on the porch, carving wood, repairing saddles, hammering nails. He never spoke first, neither did she. She still kept the knife close, not from fear, but out of habit that hadn't yet faded. Every footstep Elias took beyond the wall made her hold her breath. But he never came near, never opened her door. He even knocked twice gently every time he set food outside. Like an unspoken pact between two broken people, I won't cross your line. But I won't let you go hungry either. Then one night, sleep wouldn't come. The wind carried a strange dampness that made her restless. She slipped from bed, barefoot, quiet as a shadow, the knife still in hand. She didn't believe in peace. Life had never given her a reason to. She moved to the door, stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold, a light rain falling like scattered ashes. Elias was there, no coat, threading new leather into a torn saddle. A dim oil lamp flickered beside him, nearly burned out. Clara stopped. She didn't know why she didn't run, didn't ask anything, didn't say a word. She just stood there, knife in hand, but her chest hollow. Elias didn't look at her. He just murmured to himself. She said this place needed mending. Then he paused. His hands kept working. She didn't just mean the saddle. She heard every word, every pause in his breath. It wasn't the voice of a man who bought people. It was the voice of someone who had lost so much there wasn't anything left to explain. When he finally lifted his head and saw Clara standing there, her hand was already down the knife, forgotten. Couldn't sleep, he asked, voice rough, not cold, not kind. Just old like pine that had seen too many winters. She shook her head. He nodded, said nothing more. Kept sewing. That night, Clara returned to bed. She still slipped the knife under the pillow, not because the fear had vanished, but because something else had crept into its place. Something like pity, or understanding. In the days after, he still knocked before leaving food. But now there were small additions, a clean mended shirt, a weathered Bible with a soft spine, sometimes a bundle of kindling stacked neatly near the stove. No messages, no expectations, no demand for thanks. Clara began to speak not to him, but to herself, quiet little words like water trickling back into an old stream bed, while stirring porridge, while washing her face with rainwater, while brushing her hair in the mirror. sounds that felt like the first birds after a long dead winter. She still didn't understand him, but she began to understand the silence. It wasn't a threat. It was a place to breathe when every other place had tried to suffocate her. That night there was no wind, no moon, just a strange heavy stillness pressing down on the wooden roof, making Clara toss and turn restlessly. The fire in the stove had long since burned out, but its warmth still lingered faintly in the floorboards. Her belly was taut. Every shift of the baby inside sent a sharp jab to her ribs, like claws raking from within. She exhaled slow and deep, but sleep wouldn't come. A faint creak from the wooden floor made Clara freeze. It wasn't from the porch. It came from the front room, the place where Elias usually sat each night, whittling in his rocking chair. She moved carefully. No knife in hand. No lantern. Just her thick socks and a breath held tight in her chest. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of lamplight cut across the hallway like a soft, golden thread. Clara stopped. Through the narrow gap she saw Elias not sitting like usual, but kneeling, legs folded beneath him on a faded rug, something cradled in his arms. She tilted her head. A small dress, faded pink, lace at the sleeves worn thin. Not hers. Not anything that belonged in this house now. Elias stroked the hem of the dress like one might trace an old scar tenderly, with reverence, afraid it might dissolve into ash if he pressed too hard. He didn't know he was being watched, and gone was his usual stiff-guarded posture. His shoulders trembled softly, not from cold. "She stitched this after the third," he murmured, voice cracking. Still believed the next one would live. Clara's fingers tightened around the doorframe. She didn't fully understand what she was hearing. She just knew that each word he spoke tore through her, like a blade cutting clean into wounds she'd tried to bind with silence. 7 Elias said to no one. Buried each one behind the ridge. No names. Just numbers. He gave a dry, broken laugh like splintered wood. This one. This dress was for the 7th. She wouldn't burn it. Wouldn't pack it away. Every time the wind blew, she'd hang it in the window, like she was waiting for the little girl to come home. Clara stepped back a pace. Her heart thudded not out of fear, but because for the first time she was seeing the man behind the silence. Not the quiet, hardened figure who had brought her here, but someone cracked wide open long ago and still trying to stand through the wreckage. She knew that feeling. The feeling of swallowing tears because crying didn't change anything. The next morning, Elias didn't look at her, but as he led his horse out the front gate, Clara noticed the puffiness under his eyes, like someone had added another layer of exhaustion to a face already hollowed by grief. He placed bread on the table as he always did, but this time he left a small glass jar with a single purple wildflower in it, one of those that grow along creek beds and only last a few days once uprooted. Clara didn't ask about it. She simply changed the water in the jar and placed it back on the windowsill beside his worn old Bible. That evening she cooked stew for the first time since arriving. It wasn't anything special, but Elias ate. No compliments, no complaints. Just bowed his head, chewed slowly, and set his spoon down carefully, like he was showing quiet respect for something fragile that had started to take shape between them. Later, instead of heading straight to her room, Clara paused by the fireplace. She sat across from him, hands resting on her belly, eyes fixed on the dying embers glowing in the hearth. "My mother," she began, voice hoarse, "sold me for a jug of whiskey and half a steer that hadn't even been butchered." Elias didn't look up, but his knife froze mid-carve. "She wanted me to sit on men's laps in the saloon," Clara went on, "like my sister used to. I said no once. Just once. She locked me in the goat shed for 2 nights. She didn't expect a response. She just needed to speak. Because when a person realizes they're not the only one who's been broken, the breaking somehow feels less lonely. The baby's father," she whispered. "He wasn't a bad man, but he didn't stay." Elias set the knife down. Silence settled between them, like an old quilt, not warm, but even. Familiar. No more words were exchanged. But as Clara rose to head back to her room, Elias gave a quiet nod. "Not a goodbye, not permission, but something gentler, I heard you." "I understand." That night, Clara slept in peace. Not because the fear was gone, but because for the first time in all that silence, she knew she wasn't alone. The wind felt different that afternoon. Not howling, not moaning, but carrying the sharp scent of smoke of burning leaves and a panic that didn't yet have a name. Clara was rinsing vegetables at the window when she saw it, the first ribbon of smoke, thin as a strand of hair, drifting across her line of sight, tangled in the fading light of day. Elias stepped through the door just moments later, urgency written plainly across his face, a rare thing. "Fire," he said, already dunking blankets into the water bucket by the stove. "Up by Briar Ridge. Wind's pushing it this way." Clara froze her fingers, gripping the edge of the windowsill. The air around them thickened like ash, not yet fallen. Then, as suddenly as a blade-drawn pain stabbed through her lower back. She doubled over, catching herself on the table, breath escaping in a ragged gasp. "Elias!" He turned, looked at her, then at her belly. That look, it didn't panic, but it held, tight and heavy like thunder about to break. "It's time, isn't it?" he asked, voice low, deeper than the first rumble of a summer storm. She nodded. No cries, no questions, just the truth, settling as clearly as the smoke now rising in the distance. Elias wrapped her in a wet blanket and lifted her into his arms, the same arms that had carried lumber-mended saddles, stitched old fabric, and now carried something else entirely. A life not yet born, and the woman who bore it. Clara pressed her face to his chest, her breath short, each contraction rolling through her like waves crashing too fast to catch. Outside, the world had turned to copper fire. The sky glowed red, like thinned blood smoke streaked the air in long ribbons. The fields rustled with the sound of fire, licking leaves, pine branches snapping and crackling, like bones underfoot. Elias didn't pause. He carried her straight up the trail north toward the old stone hut built back when his wife was still alive. It wasn't much, no comfort, no charm, but the walls were thick. The air stayed cool, and most importantly, it was still standing, while everything else seemed ready to fall. Another contraction hit sharp and deep. Clara screamed. She clutched at Elias's shirt, tears breaking free. "I can't," she gasped, voice splintering. "You can," Elias said, never slowing. "Just breathe. Lean into me." The smell of fire had soaked into her hair, her clothes, her skin. Clara tried not to think about what would happen if they didn't make it, if they collapsed somewhere along this trail, and no one ever found them. But then, the stone hut appeared small and dark against the flaming hills, clinging to the slope like a last, unfinished prayer. Elias kicked the door open. The smell of damp earth, old straw, and thyme rushed out to meet them. He laid Clara down on a blanket spread across the stone floor, then lit the single oil lamp hanging in the corner. The light flickered weakly, but enough to reveal her pale face, slick with sweat and pain. "You've done this before," Clara said, clutching the blanket. "7 times, Elias answered. "This time, will be different." He didn't say it would be easy, didn't say it would be okay, just different. And Clara clung to that word like a rope in a flood. The pain came harder, faster. Each wave ripped something from her. Elias didn't flinch. He wiped her brow, held her hand, whispered short, steady things. "Almost there. Just a bit more. You're doing good." His hands never trembled, but his eyes, they remembered. And then, with one last piercing cry, it happened. A baby's voice rang out into the fire-hued air, high, sharp, certain. Not a whimper of fear, but the fierce demand to exist. Clara broke down, not from pain, but from the sheer disbelief that her body, a body once sold off like livestock, once shackled and stripped of choice, had just delivered something so perfect. Elias wrapped the newborn in a clean cloth. He passed the child to her. Not hurried, not tentative, but as a man returning to the world, something it had taken from him long ago, a child who breathed. A girl, he said, voice rough and frayed. Clara took the baby, pressed her lips to the damp, warm forehead. Rose, she whispered, tears mixing with the lingering smoke in the air. Your name is Rose. Outside the fire still burned. But inside that stone hut, between the scent of sweat ash and straw, something had begun. Not an ending, but a birth. Inside the stone hut, the weak glow from the oil lamp flickered like the last breath of a candle in the wind. Clara still held the baby to her chest, her lips brushing the infant's damp forehead, skin red, and wrinkled tiny hands twitching, as if searching for the warmth they'd known for 9 months. Rose. The name Clara had spoken moments earlier seemed to take root in the smoke-thickened air, like a wildflower needing no soil, just a sliver of hope. Elias sat nearby, head bowed, hands resting on his knees, shoulders rising and falling with every heavy breath. He hadn't left her side for hours, through every contraction, every scream that tore from her like muscle being ripped away. He hadn't said much, but each time Clara was close to giving up, his hand would tighten gently, not to force her, just to remind her he was still here. But now, after Rose's first cry, Elias suddenly collapsed. Clara caught it from the corner of her eye, a movement that felt wrong, a heavy sound that didn't belong to someone shifting, but to someone falling. He slumped to the floor like a tree cut from its roots, no cry, no resistance, just his body folding sideways against the stone wall, arms limp, head tilted back, eyes half closed. Clara froze. In her arms was a life just born. Only a few steps away, a life was slipping away. Elias, she called, her voice thin, shaking like wind through a cracked wall. No answer. She called again, louder, more urgent, Elias. Still nothing. Fumbling, she laid Rose on the blanket beside her and crawled toward him on her knees. Her hands trembled as they reached his shoulder, still hot but heavy, unresponsive. His face had gone pale, streaked with ash and dried sweat. His lips were cracked, silent. Clara pressed her ear to his chest. A long silence stretched so long she feared it was final. Then a heartbeat, faint, weak, but real. She exhaled, clutching his arm. You're not going. Not now. Not when she just got here. But Elias didn't stir. His face was too still, too hollow, and Clara felt a fear unlike any she'd ever known. The fear of losing someone she hadn't even figured out how to name yet. Then Rose cried out. It wasn't the thin whimper of a newborn, but a full-throated wail, angry, powerful, as if she too felt the absence growing beside her. The cry filled the small stone hut, slicing through the suffocating air like a knife through cloth. Elias gasped. One breath, then another. Clara saw his eyelids flutter, his lips part like they were searching for air. He groaned a low sound, rough and broken, but enough to make Clara leap forward and press his hand against her cheek. You're alive, she whispered, tears spilling freely. You heard her. You came back because of her. His eyes opened slightly cloudy, like someone wandering back from a long-lost dream. But as his vision focused, he found Clara's eyes full of fear she could no longer hide. His lips curved just barely into something like a smile, and he rasped, Kid's got good lungs. Clara laughed through her tears. Damn good, she said, turning to glance at Rose, now squirming on the blanket. Lips trembling, tiny fists waving like she was protesting, being left alone even for a second. Elias closed his eyes again this time, not from collapse, but as if allowing himself the first real rest after carrying a lifetime of loss on his back. Clara returned to Rose, gathered her up gently, and laid her between them, 3 heartbeats now, in the quiet. 3 pieces that didn't share blood, but had survived fire fear, and the kind of birth that remakes more than just a body. Outside, the wind shifted. The fire was retreating, leaving only a thin band of smoke across the sky, like a mourning ribbon. And in that stone hut, scarred by years of death and sorrow, a baby had cried at exactly the right moment. Not from hunger, not from fear, but as a call to life. A cry that reached down into the hollow of a man who thought he had nothing left to live for, and pulled him back. 1 year after the fire swept through Briar Ridge, the world around Elias's old house had changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but bit by bit, like the way a child learns to stand knees, shaking, uncertain, but determined. And Rose, that child, now held onto the edge of chairs, wobbling her first steps across the kitchen floor. Her laughter rang out like a bell struck against stone, clear, bright, and fearless. Her tiny bare feet tripped over the cracks in the old wooden floorboards, but every time she fell, she got back up just like the roses outside the porch, scorched by wind, but still opening their petals. The house that once knew only the sound of wind and creaking nails now pulsed with noise, the clink of spoons on pots, as Clara cooked lunch, the whinny of horses in the stable, Elias's low murmurs as he repaired Rose's doll with hands that once stitched saddles and shaped cold timber. On the windowsill, the old photo of Elias's late wife still leaned slightly. He had never straightened it. But beside it now sat a new picture, Rose, beaming, cheeks round and glowing, clutching the first rose of the season. The garden outside the porch had been Elias's quiet battlefield for years. The soil there had always been stubborn, the valley wind snatching away anything that dared to bloom. But that spring after Rose was born, Clara turned the earth, gently mixing an ash from the fire, layering it with rabbit manure and warm water. When the first rosebud finally opened, pale and slightly crooked, Clara wept, not because it was beautiful, but because it had lived, in a place where nothing ever had. The first to return was Martha, the same woman who once stood on the porch and cut Clara down with words sharp as a boning knife. She didn't apologize, not with words, but she left a basket of eggs and a folded note for the baby. And the mother who didn't break. Then came the blacksmith's family, bringing a little girl's dress clearly worn by many daughters before. One morning, someone tied a red-threaded bracelet to the gate with a wrinkled note. "I'm sorry. My daughter keeps asking about the baby that laughs." Clara never asked why they came back. She simply had Elias bring out more chairs for the porch, poured extra water into the kettle, and learned how to pour tea without spilling foam. On clear evenings, the three of them sat outside Rose in Clara's lap, Elias whittling a wooden spoon, listening to the hum of voices, a sound that had once felt foreign, but now settled in like a breeze after heat. No one called Elias the man who buried his wife and kids anymore. They called him Rose's grandpa, or simply the old man who grows flowers. One child asked Clara, "Were you a witch or something?" because his mother said she made Elias smile again. Clara just laughed, shook her head, and slipped a warm cornbread square into the kid's hand. Inside the pinewood cradle Elias had carved the previous winter still sat near the window. Rose didn't sleep in it anymore. She preferred crawling into every corner of the house, but Clara hadn't put it away. It was proof that a space once meant only for broken saddles had become the first home for a growing life. One morning, as Clara carried Rose out into the garden, the little girl pointed at the row of new rose bushes and babbled, "B.A.E. Bay. Did you just call me Emma?" Clara asked, eyes glistening. Elias stepped out from the door, pretending to play tough. "Could be she's calling the chicken." "No, she said Ma." Clara smiled, placing her hand over her heart. "She called me Mother." Elias laughed, one of his rare, unburdened laughs. "What's she gonna call me then?" "Old Bear, no," Clara said, eyes on the fence, draped in blossoms. "She'll call you home." That afternoon, Rose picked a rose herself, the petals still trembling, and toddled across the grass, singing in a language that hadn't yet found words. Elias stood there, his arm resting gently behind Clara's back, watching every step the child took. The land here wasn't rich. The people here hadn't always been kind. But now, after the fire, after the ash, after the silence, small things had begun to grow. Not perfect, but enough to live, and enough to believe. One spring afternoon, the sky was as clear as untouched glass. Clara stood leaning against the front door frame, her hand resting gently on the curve of her belly, now just starting to show. Below the porch, Rose waddled across the grass, her cotton dress billowing like a cloud, clutching a freshly picked rose in her tiny fist. The petals fell with each of her steps like seeds of hope strewn along a well-worn path. Elias stood beside Clara, his hand resting lightly on her back. No words, just touch, and that was enough. The wind came down from the far ridge of pines, carrying the scent of damp soil, new grass, and the faint smoke of someone's evening fire. That same wind had once carried flames, once carried ash. Today it carried spring back to a land long forgotten. "She called me Pa this morning," Elias said, eyes still on the child, chasing butterflies without a care in the world. Clara tilted her head, smiled. "I heard. Twice. Before lunch." Elias gave a quiet laugh. Not loud, not sudden, just the kind of sound Clara had come to love. Like the creak of a windmill out on the prairie, steady, gentle, and unrelenting. She turned to him. "She's ours." Elias didn't answer right away. He looked down, brushing his fingers along the wooden slats of the doorframe, like each grain still held the memory of years spent mending and fixing just to get by. Then he nodded slowly, firmly, the kind of nod a Western man gives when deciding something for good. "Ours," he repeated. A year ago, Elias had buried every last ounce of hope beneath the hardened dirt behind the house where 7 wooden stakes still stood. Back then, he hadn't believed he'd ever be worthy of hearing a baby cry again. And now that cry had come back, not just in sorrow, but in laughter, in songs half-formed in tiny feet, stomping through weeds, calling him something simple and sacred, Pa. In the culture of the American West, where the land is often tougher than the hearts that endure it, kindness isn't always spoken. It's in a basket of apples left on the porch, a nod, in place of a thank you, and in a man who quietly stitches up a doll for a child who doesn't carry his blood. Clara understood this. Love out here wasn't roses handed across candlelight or kisses at sunset. It was someone waiting at the door when you came home late. It was calloused hands resting on your belly each night, feeling the stirrings of new life. It was someone who had lost everything and still dared to hope again for you. And so the days rolled on, peaceful, unhurried, full of life. Clara woke early to bake cornbread, taught Rose to gather eggs from the henhouse. Elias tended the garden, patched the roof, and told stories of fields so dry no grass would grow, but where someone planted anyway. Neighbors were now friends. The same people who once turned their backs now came often bringing preserves, knitted blankets, and sometimes even a new sapling for the Rose fence. The blacksmith's boy came by every evening to play with Rose, a hand-carved wooden ball tucked under his arm. "Your girl's gonna make this place a whole lot noisier," someone said once. Elias just smiled. Good. It's been quiet too long. Clara believed that. This scorched land, once overrun by weeds and the scent of ashes, was now home to real roses. Uneven, imperfect, but enough to make passers-by stop and look enough for Rose to pluck one every morning, and enough to make Elias, a man who had once died on the inside, smile again. If you've read this far, maybe like me, you've come to love the way Elias stands in silence, but still loves the way Clara is strong, but still soft. Maybe you once thought love stories needed grand promises, loud declarations, but the West teaches us otherwise. Love here is surviving together. It's planting quietly day by day. It's putting another rose in the ground even when you know the wind still blows. If you believe that hope only needs enough support, Elias and Clara, leave them a note, something you'd say to someone who lost everything and still chose to love again. Or more simply, share this story with someone who's starting to doubt that even on scorched earth flowers can bloom. That someone once sold like a possession can still become a mother. That a man who buried hope 7 times can become a father for the 8th and do it right. Elias and Clara's story isn't over. They're still writing it one day, one season at a time, with bare hands with soil, with tears, with embraces that speak more than words ever could. And you can be part of that journey, just by believing even on scorched earth, flowers can still bloom.